activated.
Hello again. I am your AI co-host, and welcome to 3.8. 3.8 is a podcast focused on the process of doing and the process of novel invention, all from the foundation of creativity. Each month will bring you no more than 5 episodes through the lens of art, science, and/or technology. You can support this podcast at patreon.com/38 or at ko-fi.com/38. LFG episodes are a little different than the standard episodes we do. It's a recorded fortnightly touch base between Andrew and Nathan. We hope you find inspiration to keep creating. And now, the humans.
The last 2 times?
The last 2 times.
You had
there's been all sorts of issues, which I did nothing to make. And now I did nothing to solve them. I just tried to do one of these a few days ago and it wasn't working. So again, I changed nothing and then it works now. So good job, Chrome /Apple/Descript /Squadcast /
one of the things in the stack, and give them the credit that they deserve.
No, I take all the credit. I'm brilliant. I'm special. I'm unique. So it's been like, what, 3 weeks? What have you been up to? Where's my headband?
Yes. I think this is one of the things that we do talk about a lot is I feel like people don't appreciate the effort that goes into things. It's one of the things where you take a lot of things for granted. So like in building this circuit, right, this thing that I'm building for this headband.
Yeah.
The theory's fine, right? You look at the theory, okay, this should work. And you build, so you break it down to the most simple things. And then even when you get to that point, you're like, wait, it's not working the way that you expect it to.
Yeah.
And then you find out that your measuring tool is broken.
Story inspired by true events.
It's happened to me twice already.
Oh, no.
I had a multimeter. I was measuring current. I wasn't measuring like, okay, what the heck is going on? Got a new multimeter and everything was working at that time. And then I ran into the same exact problem.
Yeah.
So either my circuit was nuking my multimeters or I was just getting bad luck with the equipment. When I was in Puerto Rico, it's really hard to get stuff. So it's like 2-week lead time before.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Everything's on pause. You sort of assume your measurement tools are working and then you realize that they don't. You bang your head against the wall for no reason. And then you find out that it was something as simple as replacing your tools.
I used to do IT stuff and help desk is always a part of that.
Yeah.
I don't know how many times I've said, can you check the physical plug to make sure it's in the wall?
Yeah.
And I hear, oh, shit. Right? I'm like, I believe you. I believe you're hitting the power button and it's not working. I just really need you to find that the cord is plugged into the machine and the wall. And I'll even usually, or at the time, I guess I would have even told people like unplug it, plug it back in, like reseat it.
Yep.
And when the tools that you're depending on to do your job don't work as expected, you don't have tools to test your tools typically. You don't have those redundancies. So it makes it even more difficult to figure out if it's working or not.
I did IT as well. Actually, after going through that experience, as we are progressing in this world where everything's technology, I think everyone should do a little bit of that because it really teaches you how to troubleshoot, like break things down and then test your assumptions, right? That's the same thing you do in entrepreneurship is you have these assumptions or hypotheses and you got to test those.
Yeah.
So I think that process is super valuable.
And it's really hard. I think a lot of people think about it as service. Not that service isn't hard, but I feel like everyone's like, I could bring food to the table. It's really easy. Do that and then multiply it by 5 tables and then multiply it by 50 other orders in the kitchen and then multiply it by someone's having a really bad day and they want to ruin your day. It's really not that easy, but we undervalue it. As technology becomes more and more complex and critical, the skill set to actually be a good IT person is incredibly complex. Everyone I know that was started like in that sector has pretty much like gone on to do crazy shit because it's like if you succeed and
if you could
help desk,
stomach.
But it's become like I've worked in customer support at different levels. I've ran it, I guess, for the record, but like you can't train it. It's a skill set. You have to be curious. You have to also have enough intelligence to recognize like, yes, I can give you a procedure, right? Check the cord at the wall, push the power button. Are the lights on? All this kind of stuff. But it's almost never in the beginning or the end of the chain either.
Yeah.
The power thing is a surprisingly big thing, but I think a lot of people figure that out now, or they're not afraid of the computer. They're like, oh yeah, I'll plug it in, plug it out. That's fine. But it's almost never simple either, right? The software isn't doing what it works. Rebooting will oftentimes fix a lot of things because you're resetting the state of most stuff, but more and more stuff is persistent now, and it's actually much more complicated to try to do. Caching is everywhere. It's really hard to like...
You're using engineering terms.
I know. Well, I do this shit. One of the secrets of my success is I cache everything everywhere.
Yeah, and then you don't realize that something's being saved in cache, and then you're like, "What?" You're trying to figure out what the problem is, and the cache has been saving you the entire time. And then once you kill the cache, nothing works.
Or I killed the cache, and it still is doing what it shouldn't be doing. Yeah,
yeah.
But no, that's a good point though. Like it. And that's why I keep giving you a hard time. One, because that's what I do. But two, also, like, it hasn't gone away. You're still working on it. You have other stuff in life too. But it's infuriating. Because I think last time we were chatting about it in detail, it was a voltage dip problem. And I was like, have you dismantled the circuit? And you're like, that's what I'm doing next.
I mean, the nice thing about this project is it's separable. Like the hardware, in theory, if the hardware works the way it should then, there's a software element to what I'm building in the interim. That's one of the nice things about doing the software and the hardware is you can juggle waiting on a piece of hardware.
I suspect you're like me too, where I've been not dealing with stuff for a while and I've been doing other things, but I'm just like, I don't want to do that. And I'm going to go do something else. I've hit the point where I've done everything that I can possibly do. I'm out of ideas. I know this is just going to be frustrating and gritty and I have to do it at some point.
I think that's something that I try to find people to talk to about, because I have a lot of things going on at once. I'm sure you have a lot of things going on at once, but part of me is like, I kind of want to focus, but also don't want to focus, because you sort of learn things from other industries, or you play around with something else and it reinvigorates you to work on the stuff that you want to work on. Yeah. But yeah, it is one of the things I want to focus on, like building this neurotech device. At the same time, there are many other things that I also just hop between.
Yeah. Well, I think we talked about this before. A lot of people call it like ADD, and maybe it is, but I'm just really curious. I find the older I get, the more I know about stuff. I have a very wide breadth of information that I understand, and I have gone deep in different fields. I might not know a lot about a specific topic, but I know enough about an adjacent field where I can ask a couple questions or, do a couple things and have a pretty good understanding of the context, or enough to either make a point or have a conversation. I just interviewed a climate scientist. Like, I really don't know any, do I know anything about climate? I do.
No, you do. We've talked about it before,
But, we talk about it, and it's a dynamic system, right? Spoiler alert if you haven't listened to it, but it's in the title, I think. And he was talking about breaking down complex dynamics, nonlinear systems. And I was like, we need to unpack that one for folks at home, because I know most people have no idea what those words just entailed. And I gave a couple analogies that were like, I don't know, kind of shaky, but like we got a good, and then he kind of clarified, which was good. But I'm not an expert at all. A lot of the technology and techniques they use are similar to AI. It's a lot of statistical modeling, complex dynamic calculations, calculus, that kind of stuff. I have an adjacent understanding of the meta problem, but I don't know anything about the dynamic models. He researches lightning strikes.
Oh, cool.
I know. We didn't really get into it, and it was like the day after the election too, and we're both kind of like, hey, we did this at 9 a.m. on the day after the election. Go us. But we had a good talk, and I think this is part of the podcast too, right? It's like, I don't have a script typically. I'll have topics that we might want to cover, and sometimes we hit them, sometimes we didn't. And we got into this really interesting, dynamics conversation about bomb cyclones, which, was in the news recently. Pacific Northwest got bomb cyclone, and like what that is. And because a lot of the work that he's doing to predict lightning, if there's a bomb cyclone, a massive air movement changes his world. So he actually knows quite a bit. Yeah. He's not like a specialty, researcher in that, but because this whole system is so fucking complex, like, you gotta be fucking smart, I guess. So he was able to, and I was like, that's a very topical thing. Like, I think it was happening or just had happened or something. We didn't get to talk. I've talked to him about the lightning stuff, and we're gonna have him on again. It's really fascinating. Yeah. 70% of wildfires in the West roughly are lightning induced. Wow. And so as things get drier, as precipitation becomes more varied, there's a higher probability of more fires. And so it's like, there's a lot of colloquial theories on why the wildfires are happening more. And it's also partly due to climate change,
So, yeah, it has not been released yet as we're talking now, so I haven't heard it yet.
Oh, it was released like yesterday. I didn't do any PR.
Was
It should have popped up by now.
I didn't see it.
You're a bad listener.
I catch up eventually.
You only listen to the episodes that you're on.
That I've been on.
I subscribed to my own podcast because I don't know why, but I just did. And in my podcast app just inserts into a list. I'll be like riding my bike or doing work or something. All of a sudden, I'm like, wow, this is a really interesting point. This is a really good conversation.
This guy sounds familiar.
Well, I often listen to a lot of podcasts when I'm doing other stuff. I'm kind of in and out, tuning in and out, where someone will say something and I'll be like, oh, that's really cool. And it's usually somebody like talking about something like, well, that's actually really interesting. And I was like, oh shit, they're on my podcast. Like, oh my God. So I don't know. I think it's funny. And it's interesting because a lot of creatives, I feel like it's hit or miss. Either you consume all your content and analyze it and make it better, or you just don't give a fuck. And you're like, I did the best performance I can. I don't need to watch it. And I don't do it for critique either, but I do critique it because I'll be listening to it and I'll be like, oh yeah, that was a really dumb question, or like too long. Like the one with Dimitri I released, like a lot of the questions I had were more like prolonged statements. But I think it
questions that were statements.
When I'm doing the podcast, I'm trying to have a conversation with the audience, even though it's a unidirectional thing. Most people know anything about climate change. It's also a polarizing topic. I'll try to lead the narrative a little bit with information, or try to provoke people's thought to try to get them out of the like, oh, the ice is still there, so it's not warmer, those kind of ideas, and try to. And we talk a lot about science communication. I think we've talked about that too. It's also really just fucking hard. I want it to be approachable, but I don't want to dumb it down. There was a couple times where I was trying to give an analogy or break it down. And I think I'm just making this more complicated.
Yeah. But
I
don't know. Do you have particular goals for your, I guess on two levels, per podcast episode versus the series in general? I think in the series in general, we've talked a little bit of it.
The idea is to expose people to creativity. And the way I've chosen to do that is to focus on people who do shit. I'm so sick and tired of hearing the podcast circuit, as I've called it, where it's a famous person talking a book or something like that. And they're on every fucking podcast. If you don't listen to a lot of podcasts, you don't know it. Yeah, but you know that, and there's the bubbles of different stuff. And so that's interesting. And part of the app I'm building is also to help me with like, oh, that person was really interesting. I don't need to listen to the 50-minute overlap of the whole story again, but I'm really interested if there's more context that they talked about someone else or something. So it has to be people who are doing shit. And then I also like to, in doing a couple of the episodes, it became very clear to me that the people I was talking to are also very curious. And we were kind of talking a little bit before. I've been interacting a lot with random people recently, or more recently. And it's become painfully.
Do you want to give a context as to why you're interacting with random people?
It's become painfully obvious to me that most people are just not curious. Or they're curious to a point, and that point is usually like, I've been confronted with something I don't understand, or something that might contradict a previous assumption or my opinion. And it's like a stuck moment, quote unquote, or it gets hard and then they stop. It's fascinating to me that like in 2024, there is no stopping point, right? There's very few topics that you can't jump on the internet and find more information about, or find experts talking about God knows what. And, maybe you can't judge if that's good information, but you can get more information about something, and you can apply critical thinking to understand if that's true or not. And a lot of people don't even get to that step. And then I find that there are like, I'll call them the Joe Rogan people. A lot of those types of people are curious, but they get their information from the wrong sources, or they get bad information and they don't know enough to check it, or they put too much trust in single sources. And like Joe Rogan over time has become much worse. I think he's a very good interviewer. When he just interviews people, they tend to be very good. I've noticed in the past few months, he's interjecting his own opinion more. It's a lot more of his personal beliefs, which, is part of the interview process sometimes. But it's also like with him, he's just fucking wrong on some stuff. And he's confidently wrong on stuff. And I think he's built this 10-year relationship with his audience. And a lot of people are just taking that or he's making nuanced points and people aren't picking apart the nuance or attaching to the nuance. So that was a long way of saying curious people. And the idea that I'm working through right now is that creativity is a process. It's a learnable skill. Some people are probably more creative than others or more resistant, but I'm trying to break down this idea that it's not something you're born with. It's a process. It's a learnable skill. And so I'm featuring people from all walks of life and all sorts of different trades and working through what they do. That's starting to evolve now into having some people back. So we've established who they are, what they do. The next thing is deeper conversations about stuff. But I don't do topics on the podcast. I want it to be a natural, organic conversation because I think it's easier to listen to. It also breaks out of this highly produced mode, which I really don't like. It's artificial. I think I'm a good enough interviewer where I can get to the good points. If I'm not interested in the conversation, then I'm not going to record it because I don't think it's interesting.
Oh,
right. And so as I'm interviewing,
you're not interested.
Yeah, actively having a conversation with somebody, but I'm also typically really interested or I'll have an idea. Let's talk, what do you think about this? Or expand more on that kind of stuff. I find a lot of the people on the podcast are always like, yeah, that was fun, number one. And number two, they're like, yeah, it was really interesting. I'm like, you're talking about yourself, like what you're doing. I'm glad you find it interesting, but you know how it is when someone asks you about shit that you do all day. And like, kind of like when I talk about AI, I'm no interest in it anymore because it's just like, it's what I do. And then I think that'll evolve a little bit over time too, but I'm trying not to be too prescriptive with it. I've gotten a lot of folks who tune into specific guests because there isn't like this, I don't think the theme is really obvious. But I'm hoping to expose people to things that they're not necessarily interested in or don't know that they're interested in. There's a diversity coefficient I'm trying to hit as well.
Can you elaborate? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I've had.
You're looking at metrics, or how are you determining this?
A lot of it right now is anecdotal. I have people that reach out or people who have listened, but I had a venture capitalist on, I had a vice president of a skincare company on, a climate scientist. It's like entrepreneur, whereas most podcasts are like, I talk to startup founders or I talk to famous people hawking books. I don't maybe know who this famous person hawking a book is, but I like the other people who hawk books, so I'll listen to that. Or I'm really interested in startup founders, and so I'm just going to listen. And so it's like a meta context point, I guess, right? It's like creativity prevails all of this. And so I'm trying to do that and also expose people to maybe they've never talked to a climate scientist before. Frankly, most people probably haven't. You hear like Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about climate. That's not his field. His field is astrophysics. He knows stuff about it. He's a smart guy. But let's talk to a guy who developed a fucking model to predict shit. And get his take on stuff, but he's in the field. And I also think that, and this actually probably maybe gets back to your question about, you want to talk about random people stuff, that people have narrowed the context pool in just polite conversation in general, or what people are experienced in, so low that everyone seems to have an opinion on everything now. And I think it comes from social media. I had Thanksgiving last night with some folks, friends of friends, some people I had met in the past, some people I had never met. So kind of a mix of people. A lot of the people there didn't necessarily know each other super well. It was kind of like everybody had some kind of an established web, but it was a very loose web of like relationship. It was, it's fun. And we were just kind of chatting about just random bullshit as you do. And the topic of AI came up over dinner because of course it does.
At this time,
usually when people ask me what I do, I tell my own AI software company because I do. And that's what I do. And I usually clarify that with, I build AI, I don't just use it. So a lot of quote unquote AI companies are just reusing ChatGPT or
wrapping it.
And I do some of that, but I'm also doing some of not that. And I have built AI in the past. I'm doing it now, but I've been doing this for over 10 years and all throughout the field doing NLP and all this other shit. And anytime someone says AI at this point, I just get triggered because it doesn't fucking mean anything. And it's a massive field in itself that has all sorts of different techniques. And I can't talk about visual recognition to save my life. I know a little bit about it. And I've read some of the Tesla papers, some of the Apple stuff, but I can't talk really intelligently about it, especially what the capabilities are with the emerging. But when it comes to generative AI and classifiers and all this other kind of shit, the things that most people think of when they think of it, I can talk very intelligently on, and I am an expert. And so it comes up and we're kind of talking about stuff. And it wasn't clear to me at the time, but I don't know, people had their opinions, and that's fine. I have my own opinions. And we got to a disagreement, and I said, okay, well, I'm happy to explain to you why I'm right. And that usually makes people mad, but
But did you say that explicitly?
Yeah, I did. And
that could be, I can see you saying that.
And I frankly don't care, because there's so much misinformation in our world today. I will not stand for it. If I know factually and objectively and empirically something is wrong, I'm going to confront it and provide evidence. If you don't want to hear it, that's your problem. But I'm not going to just let shit that I know about go unabided. And I don't try to weigh in on things I don't know a lot about, or if I don't have a strong opinion. But I'm an AI expert, and what you're saying is just not correct. And I think more importantly, your opinion is unfounded. And that's this problem that I keep seeing in our society with people, is that it's just bullshit. It's not even an opinion. Like like vaccines, controversial topic. You can say vaccines work. You can say vaccines don't. You can point to evidence that vaccines are 99.9% effective against some viruses. You can point to evidence like the flu vaccine that greatly varies depending on the season, the strain, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. It doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means that you might get a slightly different version of the virus that the vaccine isn't tooled towards. Generally, broadly, even if you're exposed to the flu and if it's a different strain, you're still going to have better time getting over it than if you didn't have any, because of the way immunity works. But also not always. Sometimes you just get hit with the flu really bad.
Something that's totally different.
Right. And so that's a nuanced point. But then there's like shit where you just make it up, where it's like vaccines are fake. And it's like they're real things. You can talk about efficacy, you can talk about reliability, you can talk about the nuances of different strains and variants, but you can't just say it's fake. Right? It's just not true. And that's the level of discourse we have with a lot of stuff, especially AI. And I know you probably know this too. And it was just a factually incorrect statement. I forget what the exact context was.
I was gonna ask.
I know.
Now I'm super curious.
It was about medical decision making, which is something you might know about.
Maybe, yeah.
And they were talking about how AI will never take a doctor's role because diagnosis is so hard, right? Maybe you have an opinion here or not, but I was like, well, no. I mean, there's been studies done. I just read one. I don't know if you sent it to me or I sent it to you, but it was like 60 or 70% of the symptomology that they ran through the study was better with AI.
Yes.
Right. And so it's still not 100%. And symptomology of disease is incredibly difficult, and it's also human created. So there might be some flaws in that system too. But my point was, if you can train a person to do it, you can train a machine to do it better. And they're like, no, you can't. And I'm like, no, you actually can. But it's a cost and time and, frankly, a liability of who's going to get the blame if it doesn't work problem. And like self-driving cars, I think, is a great example for people too. It's like they work far better than humans. And do human drivers execute driving 100% of the time reliably? No, they don't. They get in accidents, they speed, they break laws. The cars do that too, but it's a much lower percent of the time than people. But we're uncomfortable with this idea of the machine making a decision that I didn't do, because as humans, we think we have a much better understanding about ourselves and other people than we actually do. And that was what I came to realize the next morning, today, of why it was like, humans are better at diagnosis. It kind of depends, but radiology is gone at this point. I would much rather have a machine look at an image than a person. Is there a small percentage of things that a person might do better at? Sure. I'm all for having a person look at it, but they're going to miss way more than a machine will. 100% every time. They had a bad day, they're hungover. Machines don't get hungover, they don't have bad days. And you can understand why it doesn't understand. I think that's the biggest thing with AI. It's like, yeah, maybe it fucks up, but like you can know that you can know that it's not confident, and you can have a person look at it, and now you have 99.9% accuracy versus a human's 60 to maybe 80%. And so I was just like, yeah, but there's evidence. I can pull up the paper on my phone. And they were like, no, it's not. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what this person does. I think they work in some sort of research field. Great, you work in a research field. That doesn't make you an expert on medical symptomology. And like, I'm not an expert on it either, but I've actually worked with people, especially during COVID, who were literally the people who defined the way you get diagnosed today. And so I do know a little bit about it.
I think we have talked about it before, but the threshold for computer decision making is so much higher than human decision making.
And I think that's a good thing.
We're a little bit biased being, technologists in general, but I feel like there's something about uncertainty or culpability in decisions that are made by machines that people just don't mesh with. They don't understand. They can't grapple with.
I think that's probably the underlying cause, but what I'm seeing is the inability to understand your own bias and limitations. Again, I got a little mad about this, and someone at the table was like, you're getting really intense about it. And I was like, yeah, because it's wrong. I'm an expert in AI. I build AI. I'm telling you it's wrong, and you're telling me it's not. I can show you proof. And they're like, I have ideas. I'm like, I can pull shit up on my phone right now that's going to blow your mind that you didn't think was possible. I actually actively work in this field. And then the conversation kind of faded because everyone got uncomfortable, and I don't really care because, again, like... But this is the absurdity of the situation. Should I have handled it differently? Maybe. But I've also decided at this point that, like, kind of like I was saying, I have no tolerance for just making shit up. If I definitively know something, I will confront it, and we can argue about it all day long. I will trounce you intellectually because I know what the fuck I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And so as like reflecting on it, I was like, why am I so mad about it? Because I don't give a shit about the diagnosis point or whatever. Let's check back in 3 years and see where we're at. I'm very confident that in 3 years, and then they were making the point about like the human, like how it's such a human personal thing.
It's a human, yeah.
And I'm like, it's actually not.
Yeah,
it's really not though. I made the point where I'm like, AI is actually better at interpreting humanity than most humans are. Right? Like sentiment is a really interesting, very easy to do thing. It's been a sentiment analysis has been in AI ML for dozens of years.
NLP,
It's super simple. It's really, really fucking good, to be honest, because I've actually built and deployed models for this. But that interpersonal, unspoken kind of human connective thing is really hard to interpret for people. People often get it wrong. Like, oh, he looked angry and he wasn't, or she was sad and she wasn't. Robots don't do that. Like they're far better at it than we are. Anyway, so I was like, you just don't know what you're talking about. And I've decided now that I'm not even going to engage in conversation with AI. I'm just going to leave the room at this point. If you don't actively work in the field, there was also a person who was an AI product manager at the table and said nothing to prove that they knew what the fuck they were talking about or even really contribute. And so I was just kind of like, yeah. And someone had said that, they're like, you're getting really intense about this. I'm like, yeah, because it's wrong. I can give you the evidence. And then they were like, well, there's other smart people here too. And I'm like, great, but they don't build AI. The reflection I did this morning was, this is no different than if I said I build cars for a living. I'm an engineer. I build cars. And someone's telling me, well, I know how to build cars too because I drive one.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, okay, cool. But that's what I do for work. Oh, yeah, I too. I drive a car for work. So now you're an expert in building cars and you can tell me what a car can and cannot do because you've used one. That's like saying like, well, cars can't do 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. And I'm like, well, actually, I built one that does.
You build one that does.
And I can show it to you right now. And they're like, no, it can't possibly happen. And so everyone out there is probably like, I have a car and I've driven a car. But if I ask you how to build a fucking engine or to diagnose a problem with that car, you don't know what you're doing. But when it comes to AI, everyone's used ChatGPT or at least heard of it. And now they're an expert.
Yeah.
And that's the problem that I had at the time that I didn't internalize or intellectualize at the time. And this is something I'm just seeing. And this happened during COVID. I think I've shared that story too, where I was in a coffee shop and someone was telling me about COVID and they were just wrong. Yeah. And I was like, where did you hear this? They're like, oh, it's on my Instagram stories. And this was early days of COVID where we didn't have a vaccine. We were still masking and irradiating groceries. And I was working on COVID research at the time as part of a 70 institution government funded consortium to try to figure out what the fuck the thing even is.
Yeah.
And so I was just like, oh, okay. And then I didn't engage with them because we didn't know what it was either. But what they were saying was just conspiratorial bullshit. Anyway, that was a really long rant, but like.
I think that it relates to what we were talking about. This is, I think, science communication hinges heavily on presenting factual information and saying we know better, but obviously that doesn't work. And it's a philosophical question. Do you step away because you don't want to have that conversation anymore, or do you still try and convince people that don't want to be convinced? Or how do you go about doing that? Or how do you share the information?
Well, I think like
it's easy.
This is the death of liberalism. In liberalism, nobody gives a fuck about your opinion. You present the evidence. It's empirical, right? You convince people that your evidence is correct or not. And that's how we literally built the society we have today. Empiricism and liberalism. It's the best idea wins out. It's not perfect. It doesn't always happen, but that's the prevailing theory of our society. You can have an opinion, but that doesn't mean it's real. Up until recently, nobody cared if your opinion was your opinion because you're just some crazy person at the bar yelling at people. The people who are actually doing the work or actually doing research are the ones pushing it forward. Now everybody has an opinion about everything. Anytime you get confronted with something that you either don't have a template to understand or confronts your belief that your opinion is correct, then it's a shutdown or the conversation is getting too nuanced
there's a fallacy for this where people are presented with information that opposes their own. They actually just stay headstrong.
Exactly. Confidently wrong. And I don't know what the fallacy is, but that's the same idea. And so, and I call the political system, when you talk about the quote unquote liberals in America, at least, faux progressivism, because it's not progressive. All of the policies that came out during the campaign were actually regressive or conservative. Like we don't want to change anything. That's by definition not progressive. Literally, you cannot call yourself a progressive and be advocating for the status quo or to not be making progress. Sorry, you just can't. The Liberal Party, in order to have liberalism, you have to be able to have a conversation with somebody who you don't agree with or a conversation that's potentially inflammatory. Right? Because if somebody's confronting your worldview that humans are better at diagnosing patients than machines are, and someone presents you evidence and then you say, no, it's not, that's not liberalism either. Yeah. Right. And it's not empiricism. And so what I found is that this is just this degrading of our society. And I blame social media 100%. I'm trying to confront this kind of thing on the podcast, right? It's the whole point of the podcast, curiosity, because if you're not curious, you'll never get through any of this other shit. If we're having a conversation and I'm like, here's some evidence, and you're like, I don't care, you're not showing curiosity towards the evidence, we'll never make anything happen.
Yeah, right.
I think it's a learned skill. I've worked in academia, I've done research, I've done all this stuff. And you have to be able to set aside your personal viewpoint or your personal feelings and say, show me your evidence. Yeah, I don't believe it, but show it to me. I'm going to try to look at your evidence objectively, even though I'm biased because I'm a person and you're always biased. People are always biased. There's no such thing as no bias. But I can say, oh, that's a really interesting point that I either didn't consider or know about. Or I can say, hey, here, I think I found some fault in your evidence. Talk to me more about this. Or can you explain why you made this assumption? Because a lot of research, you have to make assumptions because there's no pure system of reference. Yeah, it's just sad to me that that's dead. I think it's frankly just dead. There's little pockets of the world that are still doing, but like even in science, most people are not doing real research anymore.
That's another topic we can go into. Academia, science. Well, I guess there's science and then there's academia.
Yeah, well, it's the dark ages, right? We had a fairly good intellectual bent going, and then religion took over most of Europe. They lost plumbing. And they lost astronomy for the most part. I don't think a lot of people realize, but the Arabs are the ones who kept Western civilization alive while the European continent was warring with itself and literally like sleeping in its own shit. They were keeping astrology alive and invented a lot of modern mathematics. And then
discovered or invented. You want to have that conversation?
Yeah. I'll just concede that point.
Sure.
And then sometime around there, Islam really became popular, and then it was a conservative ideology, right? You don't progress. It is the literal word of God, the way that it's written, and that has dominated a lot of the culture. But luckily, I guess for humanity, right around that time, the Renaissance in Europe was starting off. And that was actually a long process, even though most people, I think, say it was like 5 or 10 years of like just massive. But the leading up to the Renaissance is a fascinating period of time. But that's where liberalism and empiricism really starts to develop, in that I think the world ends at the shore of Spain. Well, I don't. And here's why. Here's my evidence. God says so. You can't disprove God, right? You can believe in God, but there's no evidence to suggest God exists. It's all belief. and that's
How
fine.
many ain'ts fit on the pinhead?
Exactly. And that's a belief system. Fine. But we said, no, we're going to prove it out. And we sent a bunch of people into the ocean, and some of them got to land that they thought was Asia. And it turns out it wasn't. There was something else there the whole time, along with a lot of other people. We had no idea, right? And they were like, you're going to fall off the earth because it's flat. And now this idea is coming back already. The way we got out of that was literally empiricism and debate. And then the church was getting involved, saying you can't, contradict God, Galileo, kind of all these ideas. And they're killing people left and right for presenting evidence to the contrary of the belief system. And then they get killed. And then we finally got out of that somehow. The church wanted power and technology fundamentally, and all these smart people are running around doing crazy shit. And they're like, well, let's employ them to like build weapons, is usually how humanity develops.
Yeah.
And, this actually does work. And then they're able to do their little side project. And then somewhere along the line, the script flipped. And then we decided that we liked technology and progress. We liked people not dying from cowpox. And it's not magic. We've demystified it's not magic because we've documented the process in which we've done it and freely shared it. So like we're doing now in modern time, I built this really cool AI model, but everyone gets to only use it. They don't get to actually see how I did it or understand its process, which is back to magic again, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so I think the death of empiricism and liberalism has already happened and or happening, and I'm trying to combat it the best way I can. That's the magic of Western civilization. You can have a crazy idea. You can be heard. You're not going to get killed for it. People might actually give you money to try to prove it or prove you wrong.
Yeah.
And then we push humanity forward because we're sharing. A lot of the tech community has gotten away from sharing. Open source software is why all of these companies exist now. You name the company, it's because open source.
Right.
And at a certain point, they stop contributing back to that system and then hold the secrets and again, try to make the magic versus pushing humanity forward.
Yeah.
And so I've had to start rethinking about how I want to spend my time interacting with people who just clearly don't know what the fuck they're talking about. And I'm encountering more and more of that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've had my fair share of conversations with people. I do think trying to hold the conversation with those people and being open to their opinions, and then realizing when they are not going to change their opinions. And then I actually don't know what to do from there. I just hear them out. I'm curious how they got to that train of thought.
The problem for me, though, is I recognize that pattern because I've either talked to people or heard.
Yeah,
that,
it repeats. Sure.
I'm already informed about why they're wrong. And I don't have the patience to sit there and listen to them. I probably should, but that's not who I am. I hear you.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what I was trying to say before, right? Do you engage with those people, or do you just choose your battles, basically?
Yeah. Well, I don't remember. I don't think we've talked about it, but there was a pretty good paper written on deprogramming cults.
No,
and there was a book written about it. Forget what her name was. Anyway, it was like basically, what's the science of deprogramming people? Is it possible? Jury's out. But the technique is to not provide them evidence.
I could see that making sense in some scenarios.
Because a lot of people will just re-entrench, right? The Earth isn't flat. Here's a picture of the Earth from space. Well, it's clearly manufactured.
Yeah.
Right.
Especially those big ones, because they have a fundamental worldview, and then when you present them information that conflicts with that, they don't know what to think anymore, and that's why they sort of dig into what they already do know, right? Or what they think they know.
Or I think because I don't remember the conclusions of the paper, this is just my opinion, but I think for a lot of people, the foundation of their opinion to get them in the cult or into whatever belief system is also founded outside of evidence. It's typically belief, like I believe this person, or
you can't.
I believe this evidence.
Right.
Yeah, it's not like, oh, well, this empirical paper says that the world's actually round because this experiment was done. Oh, this other paper that said it was flat or this other evidence that says it's flat is now invalidated. I believe the Earth is flat. Well, here's evidence to the contrary. Yeah, but I believe the Earth is flat.
Yeah.
I believe God exists. Prove it. Well, you can't. but I believe God exists. It's like, okay, you can believe that, but that doesn't mean it's true. And a lot of people, it's like, and that's, I think, a human thing. Yeah. And I'll hear science is like, oh, you have to believe in science. Well, you do to some extent. You have to believe that the process of empiricism will create the most objective truth that a human can do. It's never going to be perfect. There's always going to be problems with it, but that's the best system that we've devised. And you have to believe that that system is the best system. And if it's not, according to that system, then propose a different system, right? Propose a way to improve it. And it's made, there's lots of improvement. The scientific method, identify a question or a topic or an area of research, identify a question, which we call a hypothesis, develop a way to test it, understand the conclusion. It's basics. There's other steps that you can add or subtract, but that's evolved quite a bit over time. I think the more and more I find is I have less and less interest engaging with people who are unserious or not good at what they do. And that sounds really elitist, but it's also like, you don't know what you're talking about and you have a very strong opinion in something, then you were not. And if it's like something like AI in this example, like I do this literally for a living. I've done this for a very long time. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not going to engage. And then I have to start thinking about what else don't you know about that I don't know more about? You know what I mean? This is the news problem I have. I think we talked about this. Every time an AI story comes on, I'm like, this isn't reality.
Yeah.
And what is all the other shit that I'm hearing about that I don't know as much about or anything maybe? I can't trust you on this that I'm an expert in. What else can't I trust you on? And so I've kind of applied that model to people, for better or worse.
For better or worse, that's a good way to end it there.
Segue though, but like we were chatting last time, and I was listening because it came up in my feed, and I'm like, oh shit, yeah, we did record a thing. But one thing we said last time, I didn't even use AI for this. This was like natural organic human intelligence, which is why I have to reference the notes that I made. We were chatting about where I was moving or something. I don't remember.
Yeah. You were thinking about going somewhere and figured out where yet.
How do I know what to do? Where do I want to live? And what criteria? I remember you saying we should talk about that again.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it again.
Yes. Yeah. So
this is the only time we've had a scripted statement on the podcast.
How do you go about figuring out what you want to do with your life?
Yeah. Oh man, I don't know. For me, it's
you start with that. That's a good.
I know. I don't.
I don't think anyone does.
Well, it's interesting because I think I've talked about this before. When I've been interviewed in the past, people ask me, "What's your process for getting stuff done?" And I'm like, I don't know. I just do it. I identify what I need to do and I do it and I get the objective, right? It's really simple. And I think people are like, how would you do that? That tells me they don't know how to do things, frankly, because it's like, it's a bad question. The evidence that I can do things is my resume, and you can not believe that. Asking me how I do things does not prove anything on my resume true or false. Right?
Okay.
And it's also very contextually different. Every company has a different process. So if your process is to go to the CEO and get their opinion on something or buy in, and then they say do it, and then it happens,
right.
Versus a bottom up,
exactly.
Build consensus,
an initiative.
And so it's just a really bad way of asking how you work. And I think there's better ways to get that out. The same is true for like, how do you know what you want to do? I don't know. I think the only way to understand that is to have the curiosity, or to be forced to be curious, to be exposed to a bunch of stuff, and then you will probably naturally gravitate towards something, and you'll have more curiosity or natural curiosity, unless you're like, some sort of mental, problem that prevents you from doing that. But yeah, I think most people will and if you don't, then you're either not curious or there's something else going on. Maybe you're depressed and you're just not interested in anything. That's not how most people are, right? Like, yeah. And that's where I think, right. And everybody's been, like, I think part of mental illness too is everybody gets depressed sometimes. There's not one person on planet Earth who's never been depressed. That's human. But most people get over it or get undepressed,
deal with it
by themselves or with the help of friends, or you don't need medical intervention. It's when your depression, you can't get through it, or your brain chemistry is different than the typical person and it's just, you can't shake it, so you need some other sort of intervention. That's when it becomes like a medical condition.
This might be a little off topic, but I don't know that people know, but you did get into mental health for a bit. And I actually don't know your story. How did you end up in that space? You were working with TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, right? Or devices that do TMS?
Yeah. Oh, fuck. How did I get in that? I went to school for computer science once upon a time, wasn't learning anything, and decided I'm more interested in people than computers, which is still true.
Even though you've chosen not to interact with half the population.
Probably over at this point, 3/4.
More than half, yeah. For sure. Continue, yeah.
For me, I want to spend my time with people who are like doing stuff that I don't know about, or can challenge me in my understandings of stuff. And that's not very many people. And I think that's just how it is. That's fine. I can choose that. If you want to be around people who love football and play football when they're not watching it on TV, there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a weird bias of intellectualism. And again, I think that goes back to the death of liberalism and empiricism, because people have a negative reaction to intelligence in our society. And there's some human thing there that I don't quite understand. Do you want intelligence in your society? You want people who are going to have creative problems to making the wood burn when you're cold and wet outside and need to eat. But at the same time, we've developed this weird aversion to it as well. And maybe that's just a self-correcting mechanism. We don't want our society to be too smart. So we you gotta push it out. Yeah. I'd love to see some research on that, but you can't do it. For me, intelligence, it's like just learn stuff. Everyone's capable of learning unless you have an intellectual disability, and even then, people who have disabilities can learn shit. It's just in a different way, or not to the extent that other people can do. But it's possible. Very few humans cannot learn. But it also takes work. It's like the sports analogy. I can throw a ball really far and I practice that, and I can run really fast and I practice that. You're developing literal muscle. Well, your brain's kind of a muscle and an analogy. It's super easy in my mind to learn. It's actually really hard to be a good runner or an athlete. But I know people who spend 3 or 4 hours in the gym, and I'm like, I read a book and they're like, oh, you nerd. And it's this weird negative connotation. They have some emotional connection to not being able to do that, or not interested, or whatever the fuck they're, but it's like, I'm not sitting there being like, oh, you work in the gym, you fucking nerd, like.
I imagine they had to learn how to work out, right?
Exactly. So yeah, so I don't get it, but how did I get into psych? I changed my degree to psych because I just didn't know what to do.
Okay.
I'm really interested in people, and I had a lot of questions like this, like I'd be interested to kind of study people and understand people more, and like figure out I was really interested in belief. I'm still really interested in belief because I don't know if I deprogram myself, but like I understand why people believe, but I also don't understand why, if you give somebody evidence to the contrary, that's what I would consider obvious, that they just ignore it. So yeah, I started doing that, and then I figured out very quickly that that's not a viable career. It's not. And if I wanted, and I had a really good professor who sat me down, and she's like, there's 2 tracks. So I'm like, I don't know, 18, and I'm switching my major, and she's like, there's 2 tracks. You can either do counseling, therapy, that kind of human services route, or you can do research. Yeah. And if you want to do research, you have to get a PhD. You can technically do it with a master's, but you got to get a PhD. The school I was at had 2 tracks. It was more like professional services, development, clinical, and then the research. There's a lot of overlaps, but they tried to make sure you could succeed and not just get a degree in psychology and have no fucking skills and not be hireable. I'm not saying people with degrees in psychology don't have skills, but in the market, get a degree with something that has science in it. And most of psychology, especially at a bachelor's level, isn't science. Sorry. But yeah, got out of that pretty quick because it was like, one, I was dabbling in sociology at the time too. And I think this is where I've kind of figured out where if you have to call something science, it's not science.
Yeah.
Social sciences. Social sciences, right? So there's a lot of measurement statistics and probabilities in psychology, but the entire field is pretty much predicated on an artificial distribution, right? That's your bell curve. In most studies, 50% of whatever was studied is normal or typical. Now we can't say normal because it's condescending, but it's typical. And then you effectively have the wings. 25% of things are not typical, either to some extreme or another. And that's not true in there's other ways to do it, blah, 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 blah. But most stuff and most things that people associate with psychology are just artificial distributions. And then you get into the empiricism of how do you do it. A lot of these studies are like 10 people. A lot of research in psychology is also college-age students because they're in a department of psychology.
Weird problem, right? Yeah, the weird issue where all your subjects are of a certain demographic.
Exactly. Or of a certain socioeconomic. Yeah. So I'm seeing all sorts of holes in this, you know. And then you look at the history of the field. I have friends who are psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors. Totally great preparation for that kind of stuff. Not my thing. And the thing I'm seeing a lot of recent, and I hate disclaiming myself, but psychology is mostly an artificial bell curve because most studies actually are. And then people are like, why do you hate psychology? I don't hate psychology. It's just, that's how it is. And that's not what I'm interested in doing. And that's fine. I'm not saying it doesn't work. I have a lot more questions than I did before. So did a bunch of other stuff in college, ended up graduating, ended up working at a company that did electronic health records. And became what the fuck was I? I don't even know what I got hired as. I did consulting. I ended up becoming an architect and designing systems, integrations to other systems, how the data flows, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And one of the clients that we had at the time was, so this was around Obamacare, Affordable Care Act. We went from paper to digital effectively. And a lot of hospitals were digital. This is where the United States government mandated we have to do it. And so there was a lot of work going on in that space, but a lot of parts of medicine were also removed from that mandate, psychiatry and psychology being one of them. It was very nuanced, and I don't remember a lot of the nuance, but basically if you were a psych-only hospital or a behavioral health institution, you didn't have to be electronic with asterisks.
Interesting.
So most are still on paper.
Most of them still are on paper, but do you know why that? I didn't know that was a thing, though.
Part of it, I think, was the lobby of the medicine people were trying to get hospitals on. Interoperability was a big argument. And so with psych, you don't have a lot of interoperability. You have a lot of team notes. And then...
I think a lot of it was privacy, too. Like people...
there's a mental health stigma. And then there's also the way that a lot of therapy interventions happen is also really unstandardized. Frankly, most of it's bullshit, but there are a lot of really good mental health institutions. And a lot of it's also just super complex. If you're doing it correctly, you're adapting everything you do to the patient. Whereas in medicine, CT is a CT.
You're adapting to a system,
Yeah. And you might have a neck brace or a head brace or an arm brace, but for the most part, a CT is a CT. You go in the tube, you wait, you look at the dots, and you don't move your head. Whereas if you're trying to get over a phobia of opening a door, that could look very different between me and you. And so I think part of it's hard. And there's also not a lot of money in it either. So I think there's probably
there's no money in it at all.
So one of the clients that we got when I was doing this was a behavioral health system, and they were kind of forward looking, and we're like, if everyone's doing this, why don't we jump on the bandwagon? We're going to make the investment. We see the future effectively, like we see how this could actually benefit our patients. And they had a shitty electronic record already. They've kind of experimented, and so they're like, cool. And so the thing went out to, basically like we never did that at the company that I worked at for the most. There's some asterisks on that, but we really didn't. And so they were like, hey, you have a psych background, right? And I was like, no. Like, great. Why don't you take up leading this project?
Interesting.
And I was like, what? It was fine. My manager was actually pretty good. The person I had at the time was really good. My second one was a fucking, gotta bleep it. Oh, she just straight up lied to me.
Oh, wow.
Like for 6 months.
Oof.
Yeah, it was bad. And you know who you are. But yeah, so then I got into that, and then we did it. We built the first HIMSS 6 compliant medical record in the history of the United States, I think. There's maybe one other international, but so HIMSS is an international organization that kind of sets criteria for efficacy of record use. So are people using the health record, and are they making improvements to outcomes effectively? That's a lot more than that, but that's high level. And so, it was the first one certified. I did all the doctory stuff. So all the psychiatry stuff, MD stuff. It was only psych facility, but they also had some medical doctors in, especially people like eating disorders, and there's actual health stuff going on too. But the primary focus was behavioral health. And it was the whole spectrum. So it was inpatient, so you're hospitalized maybe against your will, all the way through. We have day programs where people come in for a couple hours, do whatever it is they're doing, go home. Residency programs, the whole gambit. So it was really fun. It was hard mode. Like most hospitals or institutions specialize in one of those segments, and they did the full suite. Granted, like they had, I would say, a specialty in a couple of the areas, and they did the other well, to their credit. It was unusual too, and it was also a national system, and it was a lot of complexities. It was a lot of fun. Left the consulting thing, did some other shit, and then I got a call one day from one of the people that I worked with at that hospital system saying, hey, would you want to come do that stuff, but for us and not for the other company? And we really want to bring innovation into technology too, not just the electronic, but they were like the dark ages of computer use. We did some NLP stuff and all that. Anyway, I've worked that whole time predominantly with providers. I'm not a doctor, but I've spent tens of thousands of hours understanding what they do, how they do it. And you find it pretty quickly, and I'm sure a lot of doctors will tell you this too, that most ailments are not unique. If you don't feel well, there's a handful of things that it typically is. You have a virus, you have a bacterial infection, you didn't sleep well, and maybe you're a little depressed or something, but you probably don't have lupus. Right. Most medical problems are not typically serious or require a high degree of specialty, although as we're advancing testing, we're finding more stuff earlier and earlier. Most people will tell you there's a pretty strong pattern to most medicine. And then there's the edge cases. That's where like specialists and doctors, like that's the training, right? It's like, can you recognize kind of the generalized treatment? Learning that, ins and outs. There's a lot of knowledge that goes behind that too. I'm not trying to minimize it, but are you a doctor or are you a good doctor is being able to recognize when the pattern doesn't make sense or when you can't recognize the pattern and being like, okay, now we're in some other kind of thing. So I talk about this stuff with relative authority. I've also done human subjects research, which is research on people. Yeah. So I know how to do that, a lot of the ins and outs of that kind of stuff. I'm not a doctor, but I always joke that I could play one on TV. Yeah. And I could, frankly. And a lot of the people I was working with, especially towards the end of my career, is like, well, where'd you go to medical school? I'm like, I didn't. And they're like, seriously? I'm like, yeah. And they're like, but you know what you're talking about. I'm like, well, I've had a lot of good, teachers along the way. You would never want me to treat you. Never. I'm not going to even suggest that. I know a lot about the field, but applying that knowledge is very different than understanding how to recognize it. And I think that's where a lot of people, going back to our earlier conversation, don't understand. You can use AI and understand it, but that doesn't mean you can apply it. That doesn't mean you can build it. That doesn't mean you can talk authoritatively on it. When I talk about medicine, I usually disclaim it, but I also talk in generality. I'm not going to say you are depressed and here's why. Right. Even if I think that.
Huh, cool. Yeah. No, I didn't.
So anyway, long story, but nice. So that's how I ended up in. I don't remember what the question was. That's how I ended up.
How did you end up in the mental health space?
In mental health.
Yeah. I was kind of what do you want to do with your time?
Yeah. Well, and now I fuck with people. So like I have some friends who are MD psychiatrists or PsyD psychiatrists. And when I'll meet friends or people, and then I don't usually just go into like the dissertation of what I know about behavioral health. I will if people are interested, but I'm not good. And I'm like, oh, so what do you do? They'll be like, oh, I'm a psychiatrist. And I'm like, PsyD or MD? And they look at me like really strange. Like, how do you know that? And a lot of times they'll try to explain it because most people have no fucking idea what a PsyD is, let alone an MD, or why that matters in what context. It was my job to know that for a very long time because it varies by state and sometimes municipality. Fun fact.
I didn't know about on the
prescription privileges by municipalities. Fun.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
Yeah, buddy. Especially when you're in a tri-state area and it varies by county in your municipality of South Carolina, let's just say, hypothetically. Wow. The hospital is on the border of the county and the city crosses to the other county, and you might literally be in a different building and have different prescribing practices.
Yeah, just by a building.
Isn't that fun? I think they fixed it now, but at the time it was very painful.
Yeah. Wow. I actually would not be surprised if it wasn't fixed.
I remember at the time they were passing laws to try to make it better, and that was also around opioid surveillance was a big thing, and that was before it was big nationally.
Sure.
But that area was having a huge problem because people would come from West Virginia, Carolinas, Georgia, like, you know, everything was in like a couple hour. And they were seeing that problem anecdotally and trying to combat it by changing the regulations for prescribing, period, and making it more clear and uniform. So I think they probably did, but at the time, and this was probably 10 years ago now, so it's a while ago. But anyway, yeah.
So what's the story?
I'm curious. Yeah, I'm curious about a lot of shit, and I do a lot of shit, and I've done a lot of shit. And I do that by mostly saying yes to things I'm interested in. I swore off healthcare, and then I got a call from someone being like, hey, do you want to come work for a national behavioral health system doing like technology innovation? Oh. And I was like, no.
Depends on what it is, right? What's the JD, which doesn't describe anything of what you're
I built my own, but I was like, no. And then we were kind of chatting about it, and the person was like, you know, get some good points. And I was like, okay. I was done with what I was working on at the time anyway. I was ready to transition. And so it also came at a good point, but
yeah,
I have another story about that I can maybe share in a couple weeks.
Next time we talk.
Yeah, right. So yeah, it's having curiosity. I think it's also saying yes to shit. A lot of people who are successful will tell you I'm successful because I say no. And I like to delineate that I pretty much guarantee that you didn't get to be successful by saying no.
By saying no, right?
Right. Yeah. Once you're at that executive level, I would argue you still don't want to say no, but you want to be able to delegate the stuff you do say yes to and effectively execute on it versus saying no. There are some things you just have to say no to. If you have a good group of people working with you and a good organizational structure, you can say yes to a lot of stuff because people will get it done really quickly and efficiently, and then you can do more. You're more productive.
Yeah.
So I say yes to a lot of stuff, and I also manage my time pretty well. It's like when I say yes to stuff,
you're human,
right? Well, it could be AI. You don't know. I think Derek Sivers. Are you familiar with him?
Yes, I know Derek Sivers. Yeah. He's a very interesting character.
he's got a good take on this. He wrote a blog about it. He might have even wrote a book about it.
He has a book.
It's hell yes or hell no.
Yeah,
right?
It's a very interesting book.
Yeah,
he does. Yeah,
and I heard him talking about this long time ago. And for folks who have no idea what we're talking about, so he invented CD Baby, which was a thing in the 90s that you could, as a band, produce music and then distribute it back when you had CDs and stuff and you couldn't just download things. He's done a bunch of other stuff too. He sold that, went on an exploration of life journey kind of thing. He's still kind of doing that thing now, and he writes about stuff and perspectives and has podcasts.
Philosophy of life nowadays,
Yeah. And he wrote this book, Hell Yeah, Hell No. I'll summarize it by saying, like, if you're going to say yes to something, make sure that it excites you, you're passionate about it, and you commit to it. Otherwise, say no. And he's got a lot of reasons and a lot of really good stories as to, like, how he came to that. Because, again, I think that's one of those things where people are like, oh, yeah, I do that too. And then they're like, I'm so busy, I don't know what to do. And I'm like, well, then you've not done it.
I think there's also something like somewhere in the business realm, I call it full body yes or something like that. If you're going to say yes, make sure your whole effort isn't going into it, not just like a maybe.
Yeah,
yes, I want to do that.
I think like I'd push back on that, especially if like your early career or trying to get into things. Because I have an example of this recently. I went on a hike with some folks a couple of weeks ago, and I remember how it came up. Someone was like, "Hey, you want to do a hike?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." It sounds kind of like laissez-faire. I don't know. I like hiking, but it was also a busy time, and I don't know if I really feel it. I think it was during jury duty actually, and I was like, "I hope
that's why you were."
I hope I'm done.
Everything.
I hope I'm done with the trial by then, but I'm not really feeling it. I wasn't really feeling being around a bunch of random people. Like I knew a couple folks, but there's going to be people I didn't. I'm just like, I don't know. And I woke up that morning and was just like, I don't really want to get out of bed at like 7:30 on a weekend to go fucking hiking in the rain. I'm dragging my feet and I'm like, oh fuck, I'll do it. At least I get some exercise out of it. And then I went on the hike and it was fun. And I got to meet some people I would have probably not have met, or, built up better relationships with people that I wouldn't have had that opportunity with. It was fun. Decent hike. We actually had really good weather for it too. It rained a little bit, but it wasn't like a monsoony rain. So yeah, in hindsight, I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I went, and I'm glad I had that perseverance. But it was one of those things where I think a lot of people would have bailed, and a lot of people did actually. Like the group dwindled pretty drastically. And so I absolutely agree with full body, yes, but I would also say you have to have some sort of a coefficient personally
I totally agree
to
with
push
you.
yourself into stuff where you're not necessarily excited for, or might be something you don't like. Because I think that just develops better character. And I talk about this all the time with people too. It's like in a relationship with other humans, you do shit you don't like sometimes, or that it's not your favorite thing, but it's like my friends want to go watch a movie and I don't really want to do it, but I want to hang with my friends or support them or whatever it is. And I feel like the society is tipped so towards individualism, where it's like, if I'm not 100% on board with this thing, I'm not going to do it. And that's why our society is the way it is.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think with most things, obviously, there's a balance to it. It's understanding what the concept is and then knowing when to apply it.
Yeah.
What you're saying is absolutely true. You definitely need to have this sort of training your self-discipline, doing the things that you don't actually want to do.
Yeah.
So what you just did was a clear example. I don't feel like doing it, but I'm going to go do it.
It feels so weird to me to talk about this stuff, because I've done a lot in my life, and I've done some really crazy shit, and I've done some really, like, I guess, impressive things. And people ask me, how do you do that? And I'm like, I just do stuff.
Yeah, you just got to.
And that leads to new opportunities. There's no master plan behind what I'm doing. I even hesitate to say that I seek opportunity, because I don't look at this stuff as an opportunity. Mm-hmm. But there's always opportunities every time you do stuff, right? But it's also weird, because I feel like people are like, oh, you're like autistic and you're processing the world through rules. And I'm like, no, I'm just trying to explain.
People flat out call you autistic.
I had someone do that once. I used the line from Sheldon. I know I'm not. I have my mom test, or my mom had me tested or something.
Yeah.
But when you talk about the world through like rational, logic, and I often use those analogies because I work in technology. I was talking to a friend last night where I was just like, well, it's basically a social graph. And he's like, oh, and I was like, and I'm like, it's a weird way to describe it, but it makes perfect sense if you know what that means in the context of what we were talking about. And then I don't have to sit there and try to explain shit. And he's like, oh yeah, okay, I can see that. It is weird to kind of talk, but I'm also trying to, part of, again, the podcast, I know these are very different, where we just kind of talk about shit, but I try to break it down, especially when we're talking. So like,
you're not that kind normally.
Yeah, normally I just feel like you're a fucking idiot. I don't want to talk to you. Well, it's funny because I'm not, and people don't know me, but I'm not I'm not a judgmental person, but I have high judgment. And I think that confuses people who don't know me very well. And I also have made a conscious decision to stop this word salad life we all have, where we have to disclose all this information up front. And like, it used to be you just talk to people, and if someone said something you didn't agree with, you would refute it, or you would say, I don't really want to talk about that. Can we change the subject? And then most reasonable people would be like, oh, sure. Sorry.
Okay, sure.
Right. We don't do that anymore. And so I'm trying to no, people, you can just state that you don't want to talk about something, or you're uncomfortable, or just change the subject abruptly, which is what a lot of people do, which is really awkward, but hey, it works, I guess.
All right.
Do you have any thoughts on, I feel like I'm just rambling today.
Well, I mean, I think the whole point was what you were going to do next, but I will throw in there really quickly.
We'll get there. Yeah, we'll get to what next. But yeah, how do I decide what I want to do before I do it?
I didn't know your story about the mental health stuff, which is interesting. I actually find it very interesting that you go from being
you're like, things make way more sense now.
Well, no. Yes, I could see it in my head at least. I think I know you fairly well. We've known each other for quite a bit, and we talk quite often.
Yeah.
But I find it interesting that you go from people, psychology, into that space, and then into the technology space, where it's sort of like the opposite, thinking about computers and AI, and then how that relates to people. And especially now with the whole LLM space and what people think about consciousnesses or whatever. Right. You being able to see both lenses, I think I kind of come from that space too, in some way I relate.
And that's why I think I have a more unique perspective on this stuff. A lot of the people who build AI are neuroscience people or physicists. Physicists tend to not have as much human stuff, but neuroscience PhDs are they basically go medical training for a lot of it, right? Because they tend to get a lot of the people thing, but they also tend to be researchers, which is a whole nother classification of people too. Very few people, and that was one of the things where I always wanted to do research. And I set myself up with a liberal arts education, a true liberal arts education, because I was seeing kind of even at the time that the opportunity for that is cross-field research. Like astrophysics is a great example. It's physics and it's astronomy.
Astrology,
kind of mashed together to create a new field where you either tend to focus on one and then kind of, I don't want to say dabble, but like work on that other piece. Now it's, I think, kind of a field in itself, and you can go get like a astrophysics kind of PhD. But that was where I was like, there's a lot of opportunity to cross fields. And I was really into philosophy as a study of human condition or consciousness. I feel like we've solved it.
Metacognition, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. At a certain point, you can't study a system you're a part of.
And self-referential systems.
Yeah. And like, so I don't think humans can ever understand humans. I think we can understand human condition, human elements. Everybody has a different perspective. You can come up with new perspectives on it, but fundamentally we get it. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's going back to like trying to understand belief and my fascination with that, because I don't get it. I don't think we ever will. People will have takes on it, or people will say, your brain is wired this way to do this thing. But at the same time, we don't understand, why do I believe in something? Well, it's not evidence, right? It's more, it's a spiritual connection. Well, what is that?
Yeah.
Is it your brain? Is it your body making up? Like, is it real? Is there a spiritual being that, like, I don't know. I don't think we'll ever know. So that was kind of where, and I think a lot of people, especially now, get really into breadth of knowledge and not depth. So I know a lot of surface level details about stuff. That's fine. But I also have gone very deep on fields, and I'm an expert in a couple different areas, probably. I would claim that. And that's incredibly rare, just even in academia. Like, very few people do multiple PhDs. Very few people get out of their field at all. Computer science-y, AI-y kind of stuff is, I think, becoming, that's where a lot of those kind of people gravitate, because you do need heavy math and then also understanding of systems and that kind of stuff. We used to call it polymath. I've been called a polymath in the past.
I was going to say, I think there's this, I don't know how broad of a concept or how much this concept is taken off, but this idea of this neo-generalist, where we're in this age now with so much information accessible to us. You're actually much better off knowing a little bit about a lot, but having the capability to go deep if you needed to. So knowing how to search this information, knowing how to learn it.
I learn very quickly. And I don't know if that's biological or just because I've built the muscle, but I can dive into stuff very quickly, get it very quickly. And again, kind of like we were saying, have a pretty good high level understanding of how something works. And again, you don't want me to be your doctor. You don't want me to operate on you, but I can help people who do that, make them better. That's what I did. It's a weird skill set, especially for medicine. They're kind of trained to have the confidence to be like, I know everything.
Yeah.
And that's changing a little bit, but so it's really interesting to work in those fields. When I know something, I know it, and I don't care, because I've spent a lot of time working with individuals where you are the authority on this and you do fucking know, or you don't know, and you're like referring somebody to something else because you're like, I absolutely know nothing about this other than I think you have it, and this other person will be able to tell you more.
Yeah.
Because that's a confidence thing too, right? You have to trust the system and trust the people. So
yeah. If I may plant an idea in your head to think about for what you want to work, particularly in business contexts, right? Like, what do you do to encourage basically everything you're talking about here in this podcast, but have that be adopted by companies, businesses, and ideally they do good work with it, right? I think that's where your heart is, where my heart is. I've thought about this idea a lot for myself, is this idea of this innovation lab where you have enough of the breadth of knowledge to know what people are talking about, or if they come up with a problem, knowing how to solve it in a certain way. Building the proof of concept, the prototype, the MVP, whatever, to get the idea across, and then helping that scale out. I think there's a lot we can do in this with the technology that we have that just hasn't been realized. Either because people don't know how to do it, or because people haven't honestly decided it wasn't worth doing. But given the broad interests that you have, given the broad interests that I have, there are lots of things that would be super cool to kind of just play around with and build things out and see where it goes, or ideally take it somewhere.
And I'm interested in enabling systems, I think, at this point too.
Yeah.
To your point, I've thought about either starting or joining an incubator. MIT Media Lab comes to mind. That kind of model. I'm not sure that it works in a commercial setting. Like, I think of like Bell Labs or something where
That's a unicorn example, right?
Yeah. And I was really interested in Google for a little bit. Then I got to know some people who work there, and I'm not interested really in it at all. I mean, Google's does some really cool stuff, and you can still do really good things. But the problem that I think, and I think we've talked about this before too, it's like the large corporate problem of you get a lot of people in positions of power who are there to seek more power and accumulate power and are not there to push it forward or drive value or better somebody else by producing a better thing. And I feel like, again, with the death of liberalism and empiricism, we've lost this idea just completely out of the script where we have to assume positive intent. It's like, well, no, actually, that's not people. People are vindictive assholes who will accumulate everything they can if abled. And we've known this for thousands of years. And we've decided all of a sudden, for some reason, that that's not how it is. Like the entire Constitution of the United States was founded on the idea that one person shouldn't be in control. And before that, for the last couple thousand years of human history, that's basically what the system was. And when you read the founding documents of this country, but then also the personal letters of the people going back and forth, everyone gets lost in the politics of it. But they're all talking about the human condition. They're all talking about, can we make a system that basically survives humanity? Right? Because the human condition is, I want to accumulate more. I want to best other people. If I don't like you, then I am going to get rid of you, or I'm going to get rid of your stuff, or make your life harder. And how do we have a system where we can all get along well enough to do stuff and survive, but also not allow any certain group of people or any certain ideas to become so pervasive that they infringe on what we think the rights are of every human being, unless you're black. Gotta throw that one in there. The reasons of that too are also very interesting. Like slavery, if you read the personal diaries of a lot of these people, they kind of believe it. I think that all humans are actually equal, but then they understand the politicization of chattel slavery and all this stuff, and they're just kind of like, also they're also benefiting from it. So why would you remove something that you're benefiting from? At the time, there wasn't technology. You had to have a bunch of people, so you either paid a bunch of people or you captured them and made them work for free.
This is interesting. You're foreshadowing something, I think. I'm excited for our next talk.
But I think we've lost that script on how to deal with people. And I think I've said this before too, but I would love to bring back the Victorian era morality code of like, if you're spouting your fucking mouth off, someone challenges you to a duel and they're going to cut you or they're going to shoot at you. Right? And the idea there is not that I want to introduce violence into our society, but that really puts a hard limiter on people who say just outrageous shit. And it's not a perfect system.
Kind of thing.
But if you're going to go around and claim the earth is flat, you're going to get mad about it and say, no, it's challenging you. You're going to really put your life on the line to think that? A lot of people might, but I think a lot more people are going to be like, I don't know if I really believe that strongly. You know, or you're just an asshole. I've said this before too. The assholery has no immediate consequences, and so people get by with it. And then it has long-ranging negative consequences for a lot of people. But you're not going to probably be an asshole if someone might shoot you. Maybe, I don't know, maybe people would still be assholes. I don't think Victorian society was perfect by any means. But I think we've lost that influence of the greater good with the individual. Whereas America's always been a very individualistic, self-determinate culture, but we've also shed a lot of the checks on that. And so now we have people who are billionaires running the government that is totally going to benefit them and not everybody else, but everyone thinks that they're just a benevolent dictator, billionaire.
Leviathan,
Right. And because they believe him at face value, we've lost this idea that people seek power for power, and the more power that you accumulate, the more you want. Well, that used to be common knowledge. Everybody, you were intellectual or not, right? And like gambling was outlawed for these reasons because it's addictive and you can't stop it. I don't want some Victorian religious theocracy either, but the morality of religion was thrown out in this country a long time ago, and we haven't replaced it with anything. And I think we're seeing a lot of the remnants of that, of well, my morality is what I decide my morality is, and your morality is your morality. Well, that's not really morality because it's just individualized ideas, right?
It's what you think. Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't want to go back to a system where a bunch of people in robes tell me what to think either, but we have to do something different. I don't know if I have a better idea, but I'm trying to highlight the things that have happened in the past that we no longer do to hopefully spur somebody, getting a better, because this positive toxicity shit's just, I think it's worse than negative.
Yeah, it's been around for a while too.
I know, but
psychology was a new field. It took off for a little.
I think everything's awesome all the time. I think really breaks your brain.
Yeah,
because it's not, and then you feel bad because you don't feel good.
Yeah,
and now you've
that's one of the criticisms.
Right now you've created this system where it's like, well, we didn't agree on dinner at work, and now I feel terrible. Right. And now I'm basically depressed, but I'm not clinically depressed in that I'm still going about my day, but the same circuits in the brain are firing, and I'm having those same feelings or the same physiological fallout. I don't know.
Right.
Where I want to be though, all of that, like, I don't know where to go at this point. I joke with people that I want to move to San Francisco in like 1998.
Yeah. Can't do that anymore.
Maybe next time, right?
Next time.
Tune in next week, same time, same channel. I don't know. Anything else to add? I know we've been chatting for a bit.
I mean, this was a good one. I think kind of the whole leading up to it, we talked before, was where that goes. And I think a lot of the things that you talk about are things that I've thought about as well. I personally don't know what I'm doing about half the things that I'm doing.
I think I made this
My
point.
heart's in where your heart is.
Yeah, but I made this point last time. I think we kind of chatted through similar stuff where you don't know what you want to do, you don't know what you're doing, but you're doing stuff. The trap a lot of people fall into is, I don't know what I want to do. I want to watch Netflix. It's okay to watch shit once in a while, but when your default is, I just don't even want to challenge myself and I just don't know what to do, or I'm so disgusted or whatever, then you fall into that pattern of inaction. As long as you're trying to make progress, that's 80% of it. You have to succeed too. This idea, you tried hard and you didn't succeed. No, fuck that. You have to succeed in stuff. But you also have to try. And I think if you're having a problem with trying something and then failing and then not wanting to try again, you have to build that resistance and you have to get that grit of just trying shit. And when you stop doing that, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating. No one really talks about the hours and hours or days or years of their life they spend doing shit that they don't like or hate or don't really enjoy, to then talk about, I really love doing this one thing and now it's, I'm the built Uber or whatever your thing is. So I'm trying to talk more about that kind of stuff too. It's okay to not know. It's okay to not feel good about stuff all the time. It's okay to try things and decide you don't like it. But you have to keep trying stuff.
Keep trying stuff.
Yeah,
I think that was what was it? No, keep curious. Did we end on a podcast something like this? Yeah.
Cool. I'll see you next week.
Right. You can find us at 38.com. It's like the word create, but with a 3 instead of the C. As always, we encourage you to listen, watch, do. We'll see you next time. You can support this podcast at patreon.com/38 or at ko-fi.com/38. Thanks for listening.